It's always exciting when I come through the door and I first see Jeff because, oh, Es, it's so good to see you again. Guess who you're introducing tonight? Oh. Well, this is not really a chore at all. Tonight is this is an opportunity to really, I think, have as our keynote speaker somebody that I have gotten to know quite well over the last 15 years. Colin Campbell was born and raised on a farm in Virginia, and his education took him through Virginia. It took him to MIT, it took him to Cornell, then teaching at Virginia, then back to Cornell, where he became a professor. He had an unparalleled capacity to obtain grants from the National Institutes of Health. But his great interest in going into nutrition at Cornell had been to try initially to figure out a way that we could make cows and livestock make more milk and make more meat on the carcass. When he kept his open mind and went to the Philippines and made these observations that suggested to him that there was something rotten in Denmark. And these observations clearly indicated to him that maybe what we were trying to do was not such a good thing after all. And then came his classic and epic studies showing us the downside of casein, and most importantly then his absolutely unparalleled work in China. And this, I certainly hope all of you have read his book. But this is when I first got to meet Colin, and I have to tell you a little story because back in 1991, I was a little frustrated with the rate at which cardiology was looking at the whole aspect of prevention, so I decided we ought to have a conference called the First National Conference on the Elimination of Coronary Artery Disease. And now I had to have a faculty. And in the February, before the October meeting, I read this article in the New York Times about the Grand Prix of all nutritional studies, and the findings absolutely fit with what I was trying to convey. But I didn't know this man. I really didn't know quite how I would have somebody introduce me, so I just picked up the phone and called him. And he answered the phone. And when I asked him if he would like to present, he said yes. But that was only the beginning, because down at that first conference, it was, to me, so vitally important that we have some concepts, because we had really a marvelous faculty. And we wanted to have some emerging concepts from that first conference, and that just wasn't happening. And at the end of the conference, all the faculty were sitting there, and Colin got up and really very, very forcefully said, we have got to have the courage to tell the public what it is that was the message we want. And we hammered out these emerging concepts, and it was largely due to Colin's quality that I think often, perhaps, goes unnoticed. And that is, the man has courage. Not only does he have great scientific intellect, but he has tremendous courage. And I've had an opportunity to get to know Colin and his family, his lovely wife, and we're really blessed to have this kind of a leader who has the great moral integrity with the science that he works with and the way he presents it. Colin Campbell.
Thank you, Es, for that really nice introduction. He does say nice things, of course, and he's politically correct. And of course, you know, somehow Es and I have gotten, over the recent 2 or 3 years, an opportunity to sort of introduce each other. And so we kind of keep it in the family. So he doesn't say the things he might wish to say sometimes, because I can do the same thing to him. Now, but in all seriousness, you will learn, in case you haven't heard Dr. Esselstyn speak before, that actually he's an architect of what I consider to be the most significant, brilliant research of the past century. and I'm sure that you're probably knowing what I'm talking about. You're in for a treat to hear that. See, I say nice things about him. He says, and we're going to keep it in the family like this. I also want to thank very much Jeff and Sabrina Nelson for the invitation to come back again. Been here several times before. It's always a pleasure to see friends again and to share some ideas that we tend to agree on for the most part. And I suspect that most of you in here are, I suppose, very close to being vegetarian, almost vegetarian. For those of you who haven't been here before, I'm sure you're in for a real treat, especially to listen to this really distinguished faculty that's going to be presenting tomorrow and the next day. Most clinicians, clinicians all just about, I think. I'm not a clinician, although I do get from time to time some requests from people wanting to know this, that, or something else, and I tend to refer them back to either Dr. McDougall or Dr. Furman or Dr. Esselstyn, because they're the ones that's out there in the front really telling us how we should really be doing things and diagnosing, of course, where we are. I'm a scientist. I have been for, actually it turns out to be 50 years last month when I started my graduate research career at Cornell. And as that's indicated, I was a farm boy, and I still feel like I'm just a farm boy. I'm really quite at home. I can still milk cows. I bet I can milk cows about as good as anybody in this room. In any case, I clearly went away to school and just lived a fairly simple life, I thought. As sort of the information started to unfold, obviously, I got some ideas about nutrition that are distinctly different from what they were when I started. And this is what I want to share with you. My own take on this, so to speak, is of course from the scientific perspective. There's the so-called evidence. And I know those of us in this business, as well as those of us not in this business, we talk about the evidence all the time. Whether it's for our argument or for our views or against our views. And it really troubles me, actually, a great deal about the fact that people talk about the evidence for this or the evidence for that, yet at the same time, while this story is emerging, this evidence seems to be so confusing for the public, I think. And I spent about 20 years, actually, in policy development, developing policy for diet and health issues for the United States as well as abroad. And so I happen to have had the good fortune of being able to see how science gets translated every few years into sort of information that's dispensed to the public. And I've in many ways, I guess I've seen, the stuff that comes all the way from the test tube to the sort of the newspapers. And there it seems tends to get into trouble, I must say. So we tend to be confused as a society, and so I really think a lot about, how, there's got to be some way we got to be able to describe the evidence in a way in which we don't get all this back and forth stuff, because I actually think at this particular point in time, we have now evidence, as you will be hearing from others here the next couple of days. For those of you who haven't heard before, you'll be hearing evidence that really is, and it's right on the cusp of revolutionary change in this country insofar as health is concerned. And it's a very exciting time. So I want to just share with you the evidence, or my take on the evidence. And actually, when now, 4 years ago now, that I started to do the book with our son, our youngest son, Tom, who incidentally was in theater, by the way, and decided after he was with me for about 3 years, he decided to go back to medical school. So he's now in medical school studying anatomy and all the rest of it while I'm standing here talking. But he got involved with me. We did the book. And I came away from that experience really enthused about the idea that we just have to figure out a way to be able to convey the story about the evidence. And in doing the book, actually, I wasn't clear to myself, for myself at least in the beginning, how best I could tell this story, because biologically it is complex. The body is complex. And when you look at it from a clinical and certainly from a biochemical point of view, I mean, there's stuff going on all the time, every microsecond of our existence. And it can be confusing. It really can be confusing. And so thinking about, how do you talk about the evidence? Because there's always conflicting evidence all the time. I finally came across this sort of, notion or whatever, that the biggest problem we have, as far as evidence is concerned, we tend to talk about the details all the time. We tend to talk about the details. Not that the details aren't important at times. I mean, the details help us to put together the big trees. I mean, the big forest, of course, or the big picture. So details are important. But what we do in science and what actually gets reported in newspapers and what too many enthusiasts, whatever views they happen to have, they tend to want to pick out details and then say they're basically describing a whole world view. That's wrong. That's wrong. So this is what I want to share with you. And in doing so, and this is what we did in the book too, was to, rather than just summarizing, okay, here's all the pros and here's all the cons for this particular kind of way of eating and living, I just decided, why don't I just tell my story from the time I came from the farm and let the reader decide for themselves, why I got so convinced that this is the real deal. So let's have a look here, and my focus is this. It's past time. It's past time for a change in the way in which we think about diet and health. We've got enough information now. We really do. And we've got to start thinking about, how do we convey this information and go forward from here, because there's so much we can do with this good information. And I'm going to start out with a sort of hypothesis, if you will, and we're asking the question whether it's true or false, and then sort of just work through that. I mean, in science, that's what we do. We design a hypothesis, and we make a statement, and then we go forward and kind of think about the kind of experiments we want to do to see if it's true or false. And my hypothesis is this, and it's basically the same as you'll hear from the other presenters over the next couple of days. Plant-based diets enhance health and cure a broad range of diseases. And there are several words in there that are kind of key. You notice that I'm saying these plant-based diets enhance health, meaning, just everyday good feeling, exercise, physical fitness, mental alertness, and all the rest. And at the same time not only prevent disease, but as you'll hear from Dr. Essen in particular, cure disease. And that's a very exciting new dimension. All with the same little pill of vegetables and fruits and grains and things like that. And of course, we're talking about a broad range of diseases. That's an exciting concept. Almost, in a sense, one size fits all. If you just figure out how to do it the right way and you do it like that, I mean, it just has an amazing ability to create health and even restore health for those who may, in fact, have lost it a bit. And of course, I'm really talking about whole, with the emphasis on the word whole unprocessed vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, and a little bit of nuts. I know Dr. Esseston here, and I talk about this from time to time. His concern is, I think we agree, but his concern is everybody who starts eating nuts, they want to dip in and they get scoopfuls out. But anyhow, it's the whole thing. And basically, it's a diet that's high in carbohydrate. Thank you, Dr. Atkins. Low in fat, low in protein, so it's basically a little bit different. So anyhow, let's go back to the beginning. I was enamored with the idea in my doctoral dissertation, as was my professors and virtually everyone else in nutrition in those days, that the single most important nutrient that we ever think about, thought about then and still today too much, the most important nutrient, if there is a most important nutrient, is animal protein. It's high quality. We have to have it. It's a generation of really good health. In any case, that was my doctoral dissertation. And so then I was away in one of my first professional responsibilities, coordinating a nationwide program in the Philippines, where in fact, one of our chief interests was to make sure that amongst the starving and malnourished children in the country, they got enough protein. And there were kind of various kind of projects going on in those days from different universities and other sources to make sure, to get a livestock industry going, or to have fish protein concentrate, as they said in those days, or whatever. In other words, getting animal protein, that suited me because that was my background. And that's what I thought too was important. But then I learned from a medical colleague of mine that there's something odd about this. Here we are wanting to make sure the kids got enough protein, when in fact I also learned that some children aged 4 and under were getting primary liver cancer, and almost always fatal. Well, primary liver cancer, for those of you who may know something about that particular kind of cancer, it tends to occur in middle age and older, not in young children. In any case, that's what I was being told. These young children, some of them at least, were getting primary liver cancer. And then just sort of asking around a little bit, I come to find out that these children were the few children in the country, or at least they were coming from the sort of the top 1 or 2% of the socioeconomic ladder. These were the children consuming less like us. The ones getting the cancer, the ones consuming the best protein, animal protein, the Western kind of thing. And I thought, gee, this is crazy. Why are we going to the Philippines and making sure they get enough protein, especially animal protein, and the ones that are getting, at our level, they're having these difficulties? I mean, it was an anecdotal thing. You can't take this kind of information to the bank. You can't publish it, really. It's just kind of an impression. But what really solidified it to some extent, or at least encouraged me to keep on thinking along these lines, was some work that was done in India, shown here. And basically, this was an experimental animal study, experimental rats in this particular case, in which case the researchers were looking at the same kind of cancer that we were looking at children, namely it was liver cancer. And they were particularly interested in studying what effect protein had on the development of this cancer. Their hypothesis was higher protein diets help to prevent that kind of cancer. By higher protein diets, I mean 20% of total calories, as you can see there. That was the routine. That's the level that everybody thought was the healthiest. And incidentally, the amount of protein that experimental animals require and we humans require is almost identical. It's almost the same. So in some senses, this is very comparable. So they started out with animals, had 2 groups of animals, 20% and 5% protein. And these are animals that were programmed actually to be run at high risk of liver cancer. And what they saw, and actually never did follow up on it, reported all that much, never talked about it much over the years, was the fact that the animals given the good levels of protein, 20% protein, you can see 100% of them got to liver cancer or lesions leading up to it. And then animals given the lower levels of stuff, the levels of protein, it wasn't enough, so to speak. They did not. Well, again, fairly small study in a semi-obscure journal, but and producing these results. So the interesting thing was that's 100-0 score is nothing. That's something to write home about. In statistics, we don't need a statistician to tell us that kind of difference. So, seeing that remarkable change, remarkable difference, all as a function of how much protein was being consumed, really obviously caught my eye and was equivalent to what I thought, in fact, I was seeing in the kids. So then we got involved in a long series of studies, as remarked, funded by the National Institutes of Health for the most part, American Cancer Society a little bit, where we wanted to explore this question. I wanted to know a couple different things. This was so provocative to think that just good nutrient, protein, could turn on cancer. That was too much, especially for me, thinking that protein is the greatest thing in the world. So we started studying this. First off, we wanted to prove to ourselves that we could get the same result. Confirm it. The second thing we wanted to know, and this is something we tend to do in science, is to figure out how does it work. We always want to know what is the so-called mechanism, the biochemical mechanism. If we know how something works, then we get a lot of confidence in what we're actually seeing. So those are the 2 main things. And we did these kind of studies over the next 19 years or so, lots of publications, we almost crawled inside of the cells and looked around and had a look at the biochemistry and so forth. I'm just going to show you just 3 or 4 slides just to summarize what we saw. Some of the more spectacular stuff. This slide right here shows basically the effect of the 20% and the 5% protein. This sounds a little bit esoteric. I know that some of you may be thinking, but it's really leading someplace. It's what really influenced me. But in any case, we feed the animals either 20% or the 5%, just like the Indian workers did. And the ones that get over just in the early stages of the cancer formation, over the first 12 weeks, we call this early cancer. You feed them 20% or 5%, and you can see the lines there. The 20%, over the 12 weeks, more and more, tumor-like tissue was developing, and 5% nothing, the green line there at the bottom, flat on. And so then we decided to go back and sort of fancy the study up a little bit and switch during those 12 weeks from 5% to 20%, see what we could do. And you can see the chart there. In the first 3 weeks, if they're fed the regular good levels of protein, those kind of cancers started growing. And then if we came back, switched it to 5%, kind of turned it off, the little green one there. Put back on the 20%, turned it on. We finally got to a point where I could say, with some confidence, that we could turn on and turn off cancer development just by changing the level of protein intake. Within the limits that are very practical. This is not extraordinary. These are the levels that people actually consume, between 5 and 20%. Actually, they don't get as low as 5%, as they're usually consuming between about 10 and 20 or 25 or so, which is sort of equivalent. Anyhow, that was kind of exciting. We did that in many different ways. Finally had as much confidence as we needed that the effect of protein was dramatic in terms of affecting at least early cancer, in this case. So then we decided to look a little further and look to see what happened over, let's say, the whole lifetime of these rodents, that being 100 weeks or about 2 years or so. And these are animals that were destined to get the liver cancer. You can see the 5%, 20% again. Look at the numbers on the right-hand side, 33, 21. Don't worry about the numbers, what the units are. It just shows you a huge, big difference. After 2 years, the animals given the 20%, they get lots of cancer. And the ones that get the 5%, virtually almost nothing, relatively speaking. And here was sort of the kicker. The animals given the 5% protein in normal research methods were expected not to be living by that time. They didn't have enough protein. They're all living, no cancers, thrifty, sleek hair coats, jumping around in a cage, energetic, just with this inadequate level of protein. In contrast, the animals given the good levels, unfortunately, were all dead. So we did this, as I say, this study, I could spend a couple of days talking about all the ways we examined this particular relationship, but it's clear that protein could turn on cancer, and it did not take really high levels to do so. It did not, and we also explored the so-called mechanism. How does it work? And it was frustrating at first. We found a mechanism. When you turn protein on, this enzyme changes. We see that. You look again, this enzyme. It turned out almost every time we looked for a mechanism, we found one. And I thought to myself, where in the world are we going to go to next? Well, that turned out to be rather interesting because it suggested to me, at least, that our bodies are working. When you take a single nutrient like that, or food or something like that, and if something goes wrong, it's going wrong in many different ways. Everything, like that. It's like almost a tsunami of things. And that comes back to a point I want to make later on. I'll just remind you of that because it has to do with a holistic notion of what nutrition is all about. Okay, enough said there. Okay, now, what kind of protein were we using? Well, a lot of you already know the answer to this, and this is a real shocker. The protein that we were using was casein, which represents 87% of cow's milk protein. Here I'm coming from the dairy farm, milking cows, thinking that cow's milk is the greatest thing in the world because it has protein, because it has calcium, it has this and that. And yet it's casein that we're using to turn on these cancers. When we changed the protein from the normally high levels and dropped it down to something low, like 5%, you saw the results. Or if we switched it to soy or wheat protein, as you can see there, there's no effect. And all of a sudden it was emerging here, however simple this may have been at the time, it was emerging here. You got this animal protein on one hand, turning on cancer. You got the plant proteins on the other hand, not doing it. Turning it off, maybe. At least keeping it under control. And of course, as I said before, there were multiple mechanisms, which is another sort of observation that we found interesting. And on the basis of this information at that time, and still today, If you know anything about chemical carcinogens, you've heard about chemical carcinogens, I'm sure. A lot of people think that's what causes cancer when we're consuming food. You know, this chemical, that chemical, some other chemical. Well, it turns out that, and I know those studies quite well, I've lectured, in fact, in those institutions that actually do that kind of work and decide what's a chemical carcinogen and what's not. We actually looked at this question concerning casein and its effect to be a chemical carcinogen. And I think I can fairly well say today that the most significant chemical carcinogen ever discovered is casein, cow's milk protein. Well, either that is really crazy. I think it's true. It's very significant. Either that is what we have to concern ourselves, and nobody wants to hear that, or we have to go back and revisit the whole sort of scenery, the whole business of deciding what's a chemical carcinogen and what's not. You know, we get worried about ALAR and DDT and this and that. Not to say that, you know, we shouldn't be concerned about those things, but that's what we tend to think. We're ignoring something when we do that. We're ignoring the proposition that cancer is basically influenced primarily by an inappropriate level of nutrient intake. That's what it's about. And we could go on about that, and I'll return to that. We actually looked at some other nutrients too. It's really the nutritional imbalances as presented by certain kinds of foods that actually can actually turn on cancer. Okay, one last little bit here. Because I have to tell you this is all before the so-called China study. This and a number of other studies too that actually influenced my way of thinking. This is something that we also had to consider too. I told you just about 5% and 20%. 5% didn't do it, 20% did do it. Well, what about, you know, the intermediate levels like 4, 8, 12, 16, 20? And something really interesting turned up. You could feed, in this case, up to 10 or 12% protein or so. The cancer didn't grow. As soon as you exceeded that, that's when it took off. And it was almost, it leads to this sort of simple notion. As soon as enough protein is present to serve the body's needs, which turns out to be 8, 10% or somewhere around there, as soon as enough protein to serve those needs, going in excess of that, we're asking for trouble. And where do we as human beings consume protein? 95% of us consume protein levels in excess of 11%. We're somewhere between 11 and 20, 25%. So you just put those few thoughts together. Wow. Let's look here a little more seriously at this thing. And there's something about protein. And why do we have this reverence for protein? Why is it such an awesome thing? You know, that sort of drives our thinking in so many different kinds of ways. And that was one of the thoughts that came out of that. In any event, at this particular point in time, rather than going out and telling the world, you know, we discovered the most important carcinogen that you will ever consume is in your glass of milk, had I done that, somebody would have probably taken me out before I'd ever gotten here. But in any case, I was interested in this other idea. Rather than focusing on one thing, whether it's protein or not, or however important this was, and however significant all this was, rather than focusing on just that one nutrient, I thought, wait a minute, we had evidence that we should think about everything together. You know, we do research on one nutrient at a time. When in fact, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, we're consuming food. So we have to think about all the other things. Foods have obviously many different things, different kinds of nutrients that we are familiar with. And so in order to expand our horizon a little bit on this is the kind of questions we would tend to ask in trying to find that larger context. Maybe casein is representative of animal protein, for example. Now, even though we didn't do sophisticated studies along these lines to see that's true or not, I can tell you, though, I think with a great deal of confidence, that the casein effect in increasing cancer is very similar to the same effect that would be produced by other animal proteins as well. So I think what we're really looking at here is an animal protein effect, not just casein. So that's one question, is sort of expand our horizon a bit. Here's another one, even broader. Maybe animal protein is representative of animal foods. Maybe it's not just protein we're talking about. As I said, we should be talking about animal foods. Because animal foods have, you know, they got some fat and different kinds of fat a little bit, mostly saturated fat. But, you know, they've got some calcium, in at least in the case of milk, of course. It's sort of different concentration of energy and so forth. So maybe it's not just the protein. We should look at animal foods, let's say. But then, as we consume more animal foods, like our society tends to do, we tend to consume less plant foods. We tend to push the peas aside on the plate while we're still keeping our filet mignon. We don't consume that much in the way of vegetables, you see. So as animal foods go up, hypothetically creating some problems for us, plant foods tend to go down. And we know now that plant foods tend to be very protective, across the board and in many different ways. So, it's a combination of both things. And of course, we want to know, too, how does this apply to humans? The data that I had shown you was largely experimental animals at the time, supplemented a bit by some observations in humans. And finally, we want to know whether this also applies to other disease conditions. I had thought at the time that, it would be really crazy that if we were learning that high animal foods diet, for example, would turn on cancer on the one hand, and on the other hand, it would actually reduce risk of heart disease or increase osteoporosis or decrease. I mean, could you imagine nature have played such a trick on us over such a long period of time? I mean, I just sort of thought it was common sense that if we were learning something as profound as the effect of diet with cancer, it probably was the same kind of diet that would actually be protective against other diseases as well. It made sense at least, but it needed to be proven, it needed to be sought out to get some evidence on that. Now for the China study. That was the background, with these various kinds of ideas emerging that for me it was a bit of a struggle, as I said, because coming from the farm and trying to figure out how to make cows grow more efficiently and so forth in my early part of my career, I had to kind of face up to some of these difficulties. At the time we started the China study, which was in 1983, just prior to that, the first senior scientist from China, Dr. Chen Zhou, a very good friend of mine, first senior scientist from China to visit the United States, came to Cornell and spent almost a year in my laboratory, and that's how it really got started. But before I tell you just a couple of things about the China project, I want to share this with you first because this shows something here that's really kind of interesting. This is the kind of information we had available at that time. Namely, if you plotted, for example, in this case, a bunch of different countries, and along the x-axis at the bottom, you plot something like one of the food, something like animal protein intake, and up the other axis, breast cancer. That's an impressive relationship. See how the higher the animal protein intake, the higher the breast cancer? That is really impressive. Now, I must tell you, this is a reconstruct of what actually was done, because back in the 70s, when this was done by the late Ken Carroll, University of Western Ontario, a friend of mine, he actually was looking at the relationship between fat intake, total fat intake of breast cancer, which in turn was what really led to the whole idea of consuming low-fat foods in those days. But it turns out, in retrospect, I've gone back and looked at this data, and the same kind of slide can be put together for animal protein intake. So the higher the animal protein intake, the higher the breast cancer risk. We'll come back to that in a moment. That's one thing. It showed a remarkable effect of diet on something like a serious disease like cancer. I mean, there's some places in the world where breast cancer hardly exists, as you can see there. And then the other thing was that there were some studies emerging at the time that when people moved from, let's say, a low-risk area to a high-risk area, see the arrow going there, or vice versa, they would take on the risk of the country to which they move. And they weren't changing their genes, by the way. I mean, these studies were organized so that they weren't even intermarrying into the local population. They were sort of focused on groups of people who kept their genes as they were, if you will. And so the disease emerged as a function of their change in their diet and lifestyle. So we called them migrant studies. And there's a couple of important observations. They still are standing the test of these days, just as much as they did then. Okay, enough for the background for the China study. So the China study started. It really started when Dr. Chen was with me and we learned about the Chinese government, his government, actually completing a major nationwide study of how much cancer existed across his country. This was initiated by the late Premier Zhou Enlai, who at the time was dying of bladder cancer and wanted to know something about cancer. So they went out and surveyed a total of 2,400 counties for the years of 1973 to 75 for about a dozen different cancers, and then that came out in 1981, when Dr. Chen was with me, these marvelous atlases of cancer incidence, cancer mortality in this case. And what you can see here is that there's some places in China where the disease is common and other places where it's not. Big differences. The differences in the high-risk rate regions and low-rate regions were huge compared to here. When we were talking about a 1.5-fold difference from one part of the country to another here, we're talking in this case here of several dozen-fold, several hundred-fold. So cancer was proven to be a geographically localized disease. That was an important consideration. You know, a lot of people think cancer was, it's in the family, you know. These fatalistic ideas that, you know, you're going to get cancer, you're not going to get cancer, it's just the luck of the draw. Well, the fact of the matter is cancer was proven in this case to be a geographically localized disease, which in turn suggested as a function of what we do with our lifestyle, and our diet included, of course, not in our genes. So we organized a study jointly funded by the United States government and the Chinese government. It was the first project actually that was undertaken in that fashion by our two governments. We selected 65 counties across the country, 130 villages. We've since gone back and supplemented this. We're up to 170 villages now. You can see where these counties were. We collected an enormous amount of information. Now, go back and just for a second, think about what I said before. The animal protein thing was really interesting. But as I mentioned before, I think it was a lot more than about animal protein. So we wanted to look at, the nutrient characteristics of this population from many different perspectives. And we did that by measuring how much they were consuming in the way of food. We could calculate how much nutrients they were consuming. And we measured things in their blood and their urine and things like this to get a really good objective feel for what their nutritional status really was. And we collected this kind of information here. You can see here we went to the homes and measured exactly what they ate over 3 days. We did a questionnaire asking them, how are you smoking and what kind of cigarettes are you using, what kind of tobacco, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Blood samples, urine samples, food samples. These samples then were analyzed over the next several years in about 24 different laboratories around the world. We went out and chose the laboratories that were the best at analyzing whatever it is we were interested in. A lot of these analyses were taking place in my own laboratory and in China and in the University of Oxford. The University of Oxford was one of our partners, a major partner with us. Sir Richard Peto, a brilliant statistician and epidemiologist, was involved in this. So it was a multi-institutional kind of activity. And here's briefly, I wish I could tell you about all the details of the China study, but this will show you why the Chinese study was a little bit unique in this case. Here's a comparison of the diets of China and the United States in terms of some things that we tend to think about. Fat intake, for example. In this country, about 35 to 40% of our of our calories comes from fat. 35 to 40% of our calories comes from fat. That's the United States. In China, the average is 14. They're consuming real low-fat diets. Really low-fat diets. China, dietary fiber intake, and fiber only comes from plants, as you may know, not in animals. And there's hundreds of different kinds of dietary fiber fractions, by the way. It's not just one entity. So fiber is about 3 times higher in rural China, meaning much more plants. The interesting thing was the animal protein, the next one down. The concentration of animal protein in our diet is about 10 times greater than in rural China. That was really interesting. We had a range, too, to work with. Blood cholesterol level is much lower in China. Our average for the population in those days ranged from about 170 to 290 milligrams per deciliter. In China, it was 90 to 170. Their high was their low. These are really interesting things here. I won't get into the others in the interest of time. But basically, this little comparison here, showing you big differences, tells us this, that the diet in rural China was largely plant-based. It was mostly plant-based. There were areas in China where there was almost no animal food consumed, maybe just an occasional feast day or something like that. Up to almost like 0% of the total protein being from animal sources, for example, up to maybe a level of about 20% at the highest level. So we're ranging from 0 to 20, a range to work with for sure and analyze some things, but still a rather small amount of animal food. In contrast, see, China 0 to 20%, we are more like 50 to 90%. So we're consuming a diet that's, very, very different. Actually, given that, I should tell you, because the Chinese and across these rural counties were consuming a diet mostly made of plant foods, I didn't expect to really see much, because I thought at that time that since most of them are consuming mostly plant-based foods anyhow, they're only putting in a little bit of animal foods, if you will. In my view, it wasn't enough to actually see a response. And so that was the bias we had, or at least the thought we had at the time. But then we started looking at all these so-called correlations. We were correlating this factor with that one. We had about 100,000 correlations for the statisticians in the crowd here. I mean, there's a lot to work with. Statistical information was available for these correlations. And so we just started comparing them all, this huge volume of data, and exploring them in some detail and taking them one at a time and sort of sorting it out, always with an eye, at least in my view, to look for the bigger picture. And this is basically a brief summary of what we found. That amongst all these different associations, whether we're looking at fat intake versus breast cancer, whether we're looking at some beta-carotene versus lung cancer, what have you, in short, for minimal disease risk, virtually all favor the nutrient composition of plant-based diet. That was exciting, because it was basically a major step toward, in a human study in this case, a major step toward sort of reflecting what we already knew beforehand. And by that time, I'm simply saying this is, let's say, late 80s, it's coming out this way or so, and say, gosh, we got to face up to this. And we're, of course, other studies, too, of many other labs sort of point in this direction as well. And so we had to start taking this plant-based diet idea seriously. And so I was sort of aware in those times, as were some of my colleagues, that there were also dietary relationships beginning to emerge in the scientific literature for other diseases as well. But then when my son Tom and I got around to doing the book, we decided to expand that kind of thinking a little bit, look into the scientific literature, and to see if this plant-based thing operated in the same way with other kinds of diseases. And here's just a list. Here's just a list. A plant-based diet, basically, whole plant-based fruits, vegetables and fruits especially, tend to reduce the risk for all these different diseases and more. I should have put on there hypertension. There was a number of others I could put on there as well. It turns out that a plant-based diet, done right, without adding back oil, fat, and sugar, whole foods, whole plant-based foods. I'm not talking about making a plant-based diet out of sugar and white flour and a little oil, all from plants, because then you just end up with a Danish. I'm talking about basically whole plant-based foods, essentially, okay? There's beautiful, fantastic stories with some of the stuff, just amazing stories. I mean, multiple sclerosis is one of my favorites. Dr. John McDougall may tell you something about that, because he got to know the gentleman who actually ran a study on multiple sclerosis for something like 40 years, Dr. Roy Swank, and what he was able to show. That multiple sclerosis, that's a serious disease. I think most of you would agree. MS is a serious disease. You look on the website, for example, there's 3 different professional websites for MS. You don't see anything about diet. But we have information, Dr. Swank in particular just got information, that multiple sclerosis, 90%, he was able to stop multiple sclerosis from progressing for 97% of his cases, by mostly going to a plant-based diet, low-fat plant-based diet. But the professional societies, they don't want to tell you this. And this information was published in the very best journals, like Lancet, for example. So by this time, recognizing that nutrition is more than a single nutrient, yes, lots of different nutrients. Recognizing that there's something about animal protein and animal foods being at the center of this, causing problems. Something about whole plant-based foods also being at the center of this. The ratio of the two is important. And also based on a lot of biochemical things that I won't have the time to discuss here, which I found to be the most interesting and provocative of all, I think. I decided to come up with a new definition for nutrition. I say it's a holistic, comprehensive, and highly complex biological concept to start with. Nutrition is not about figuring out what vitamin C does to prevent scurvy. It's not about vitamin B1 or thiamine, for those of you who may be interested in preventing beriberi. No. Nutrition is about consuming foods of the right kind and getting all the right mix together. That's what I mean by being holistic. Operating through these multiple mechanisms. I mean, there's so many different levels of this idea that you can think about that makes this very exciting. And of course, nutrient supplements, which is in fact the corporate way, the commercial way of extrapolating nutrition to the public, one nutrient at a time, if you will. That's not nutrition. It's not nutrition. That's pharmacology. That's not whole foods. And in fact, we've got some remarkable data now that's just showing up after 20 years of experimentation to show that not only do some of these favorite nutrient supplements not work as we thought they did in the beginning, but they actually may enhance disease risk. So nutrition, just forget about the idea that nutrient supplements has something to do with nutrition. It doesn't. It really has to do with these nutrients being present in foods and things working together that way as nature sort of provided them. That's what I'm talking about. Now, I just wanted to kind of really hit this point home a little bit because it has to do with what I consider to be a very exciting concept. Because when you think about it this way, it turns out that nutrition is so powerful, to do the kind of things to create health that we're all interested in. If you just ask this question here, if you consume food as we did tonight, how many chemicals, different kinds of chemicals, do you think we are consuming in that food? I mean, your guess is as good as mine. Probably hundreds of thousands of different kinds? Millions? I mean, it's a huge number of different kinds of chemicals. And one, what you might consider to be one chemical, like, let's say, pick dietary fiber, for example. There's a whole range of sort of structural differences in the different fibers doing different things. It doesn't even make sense to ask how many there are, because for any one of these nutrient classes, there's just almost a continuum of activities across the whole spectrum. So we got a whole bunch of stuff going in there at the same time. Now, think about this, and we'll put an idea together for you. First, you're consuming food with all kinds of nutrients present in them, or chemicals, or whatever you want to call them. Let's just think about just one chemical at a time. We consume it gets into our intestinal tract, we digest it. That's a control point because our body decides on how much of it should be digested and released from the food, given a lot of different circumstances. The body decides on how much it wants at any given point in time. Then the amount that gets actually released from the food, if you will, and then gets absorbed into the bloodstream across the intestinal wall, that's absorption. There's lots of control points there too. The body decides on how much of it should be absorbed, given the circumstances, given how much the body wants at that moment in time. It gets into the bloodstream. Now again, it can be carried through the bloodstream, just as a free chemical floating around, or maybe someone can be bound up to like a little carrier protein molecule, something like that, that's not very active. And the body decides again, what proportion is in the free form, which tends to be rather active, and what percent stays sort of relatively inactive. Another control point with a continuum. Then the body decides on how much goes here, how much goes there, how much goes someplace else. Which organ gets the bulk of the share, the bulk of the thing. Again, depending on what the body wants to do with it. And then you get to the biochemical pathways. Absolutely fascinating. These chemicals go to our organs and get changed in many different ways. Any of you been in a lab before? You've ever seen these metabolic charts? Gut reactions go in 1,000 different ways. Well, I'm just talking about one chemical. It goes in there, it goes this way, that way, and then these products, they go this way. I mean, it starts building a tree and goes many different ways. Again, all under the control of the body, every one of these steps. Deciding every microsecond, right now when you're sitting here and I'm here talking, every microsecond, every moment, the body's deciding what to do with chemical X or Y or Z and where to put it. Decides maybe to put some in storage, decides that. What proportion goes in storage, decides what proportion gets excreted. Now, just stop and think about this. So many control points from A to Z. From A to Z, so many control points. And the body decides every moment, every microsecond, on how much goes where. That's just one chemical. Now we're going to take two chemicals. You put two together, and both of this kind of stuff is going on. Okay? But when they are interacting like that, they each influence the other's activities. That would be different from what it would be when they were acting independently. So they got two things working together. Now put 10, 20. Let's put 100,000 together. You know, our minds can't comprehend this. No way. And when you actually think of it that way, and you think about the interactions, and then you start looking for dietary patterns, you know, what kind of nutrient mixtures actually tend to work to do whatever it is you want to work. It's amazing. We start looking at these control points, these that I just mentioned. We know a lot about the control points. In other words, what I'm trying to bring to your attention is that the whole thing is biologically complex. There's so much stuff going on at the same time. And we know a lot about, you know, these control points, stuff like this. And when you start thinking about it that way, then all of a sudden, it's like an elephant in a room. You finally realize that there's a trunk there. You know, there's a sort of, there really is, there's something in the room here. And you see it all put together. And it becomes so eminently clear that whole plant-based foods, vegetables and fruits in a fresh form, not fractionated and fragmented and put back together, like I said before, to make something strange for dessert. But you know, the whole plant, that's the way we were eating over the evolutionary times. That's how we got to where we got to. And that's the kind of food, in fact, we ought to be consuming. Now, yes, we're sure. Point can be made that we consume some animal foods too, although that's in some considerable dispute amongst some of the paleontologists that I've been visiting with or talking to. And in any case, there was only a small amount of that as we were sort of going through that formative stage of our evolutionary development. Our nearest primate relatives, even according to the guy who was the most enthusiastic about us being omnivores, actually admits that only 3 to 5% of our food likely came from animal foods, and it came from insects for the most part. Anyhow, if you look at the biochemistry of this, the only way that this kind of thing can be constructed, this complexity can be constructed, is if the resource for that construction arose from the consumption of plant-based foods. That's where health is. Okay, that's where I sort of get this idea, this holistic thing is so important. Now let's look at animal foods and plant foods, just in terms of some popular sort of kind of things. You can see there's major difference between animal foods and plant foods. Animal foods are very low in complex carbohydrates, almost none. A little bit of glycogen and stuff like that. Plant foods are very high. Animal foods have cholesterol and plant foods don't. Dietary fiber. Plant foods has dietary fiber, but animal foods don't. And keep each one of these fractions here, you know, there's infinite combinations, of course. Protein is somewhat higher in animal foods, somewhat lower in plant foods. They both have protein, obviously. Animal foods have almost no antioxidants, insignificant, relatively speaking. Plant foods have hundreds of thousands of different kinds of phytochemicals, antioxidants, all these beautiful colored things that, you know, that help us to keep things under control. And of course, the saturated and unsaturated fats are also quite different. In other words, what I want to say here, we got this is the big story. Animal foods are over here and plant foods are over there. And when we talk about animal foods, guess what dairy is? Why did vegetarians, 90% of vegetarians over the recent decades, decide to consume, 90% of vegetarians decide to consume dairy? And oftentimes in some surveys more than did non-vegetarians. They aren't gaining much. Vegetarians are not gaining much. Gaining a little bit, not a lot. Not by consuming dairy or eggs. Dairy is an animal food in spades. And if you start looking at it in terms of its content of nutrient characteristics, which in turn determine disease, you've got to expect that dairy's got a problem. So that's just an aside. Let me just show you just a couple of things here, and I'll move on, finish up here quickly. Here's some evidence that's sort of been in the literature in recent years, kind of exciting, on this dairy question. Here's a publication from Yale University, published now 15 years ago, showing a relationship between dietary animal protein intake and bone fracture rate for different countries. It's reasonably impressive. The higher the animal protein intake, the higher the bone fracture rate, or osteoporosis, if you will. We also know how it works, by the way. When animal protein is consumed, in the case of humans, we look at it a little more carefully. It creates a metabolic acidosis, which then is buffered by calcium pulled out of all that kind of stuff. So there's quite a plausible, reasonable sort of relationship to be seen. We also know, and I don't have the chart here, I've been meaning to get it, I keep forgetting. If you plot calcium along the bottom, which was done in the 80s, versus fracture rate along the left hand, the higher the calcium intake, the higher the fracture rate. So then you ask yourself, where do we get our extra calcium and protein, our animal protein from? Almost entirely from dairy. So if you plot dairy food intake on that x-axis at the bottom, the higher the dairy food intake, the higher the osteoporosis rates, not the lower. That's exactly what the dairy industry has been telling us all these years, haven't they? Okay, milk consumption. Here's some newer data. 2005, here's a relationship, strong relationship between milk consumption and uterine cancer. That's pretty striking. Here's milk consumption and prostate cancer. Men are not left out of this equation. In this case, this plot is for non-fat milk. In other words, this is a protein product. The higher the milk protein is, the higher the prostate cancer rate. Here's milk consumption and breast cancer. Again, that's pretty impressive. These are all reproductive cancers, by the way. You can see how dairy gets in there. The same thing, incidentally, can be shown, of course, by other animal-based foods as well. But dairy fits the pattern very nicely. And I think I'm getting over, I won't have a time to get into this, but we were able in our China study to actually construct a model to explain why, I think, at least, the cause of breast cancer in large measure. The cause of breast cancer really has to do with young girls consuming diets too high in animal-based foods, animal protein in particular. They start their menstrual periods earlier in life. If they continue doing that, they end their reproductive years later at menopause compared to the Chinese. Those two curves that you see there. See the Western women, rural Chinese women? Western women start in their reproductive life around 11, 12 years or so, ending about 52. Chinese women, 17, they're starting on average. Rural China, much lower protein diets, less animal food. In other words, a Western woman has about an 8 to 9 year longer reproductive life than does a rural Chinese woman. And in addition, to make matters a little worse, when the menstrual period starts, reproductive years roll around, as you all know, estrogen levels go up. And they stay pretty well up during the reproductive years. And you get the fluctuations, obviously, during the monthly course of events. But basically, it goes up and kind of stays pretty high compared to rural China. And circulating levels of estrogen have been related to breast cancer risk and these reproductive cancers for various and sundry reasons. Turns out, when you take into consideration, when the reproductive years start and when they end, generating extra estrogen levels, and that tends to be higher for Western women, and we measured these things in Western women and Chinese women. The total exposure to estrogen for the Western woman is about, as you can see there, is about 4, even 5 times greater than world China, and so is breast cancer that high too. So I think we're very close to understanding what causes breast cancer, but it's a story that's not being told. So let me just finish up here. And just a little bit of a summary again on nutrition. I actually think that nutrition, of all the medical sciences we can think about, nutrition ought to be the premier biomedical science of the future. It has so much to offer. It involves the integrated effects of countless food constituents. Okay, I already said that, I guess, before. It's basically nutrition, and we must not forget, nutrition is, of course, coming from food for the most part. That's the way we think of it, at least. When it's supported by appropriate exercise, adequate amounts of water, some sunshine, it's really greater than the sum of its parts. You put the whole package together, you've got a lifestyle program centered on nutrition, of course. It's really pretty extraordinary. It can actually prevent disease, cure disease. It does a whole range of things all at the same time. It's basically like a symphony. That's the way I see it. So now I'm going to finish up just a little bit. 3 slides here. I get frustrated. I've gotten frustrated, to be honest about it. I've got to guard myself against being too cynical, because I think the information we now have is so extraordinary. I mean, I was so excited when I heard Dr. Esselstyn had done this study. Of course, Dr. Dean Ornish did it too for a year in the beginning, and Dr. Esselstyn started on longer studies he'll tell you tomorrow. But, the whole idea that a serious disease like heart disease in very late stages can be prevented, wow, reversed, extraordinary. And then all the other things that nutrition can do, keep bad genes under control. That's another story that's got to emerge before we forget it. So why is all this so invisible? I want to tell you just a little bit of one example. There's many examples now emerging. And this is based on my experience working on these expert panels, developing policy, sort of sorting out science, deciding what to say and what not to say. And I'll just briefly tell you, there's 2 committees in Washington that make our policy. One is called the Food and Nutrition Board of the Institute of Medicine and National Academy of Sciences. They meet every 5 years. They've been doing so since 1943. They look at all the science, and they tell us how much of this nutrient we need and how much of that nutrient we need, and so forth and so on. It's called Recommended Dietary Allowances, or RDIs these days. They put some numbers together for us. And then they take this rather august, detailed document and pass it off to the second committee, the Dietary Guidelines Committee, under the aegis of the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture. They sort of take all these numbers and they make some pictures for us, like a pyramid, so you can show us, us simple folk, what we should be doing. So the pyramid gets constructed. And in the most recent 2002 report of the Institute of Medicine, when they're coming up with the recommendations, there was a report that was about 1,000 pages, or a little less, I guess it was. And they highlighted in their first page their main findings so that they could minimize, these are the findings that minimize risk for chronic disease. That's our quote, that we now may consume diets up to 35% protein, 35% fat, and we can make up 25% of our calories as added sugars. That's what and where we're minimizing risk of chronic disease. That's what they said. I looked at this, I thought it was a typo. Called a couple of friends of the committee to try to find out what's going on here. What are you people doing? Because the protein thing, which everybody wants to ignore, nobody wants to go there. On the protein thing, it was going from 10% up to 20%, where we're seeing all these rather, exotic things happening. Going to 35%, and people aren't even there, except for maybe a few Atkins gurus. Anyhow, that's pretty sad. That's pretty sad. So my son Tom and I sit down and said, okay, we were doing a book at the time, let's sit down and put together a diet that minimizes risk for chronic disease based on these numbers. It's a really nice diet because it's got 18% protein, 31% fat, 51% carbs, as they call them, 23% added sugars. And that's a nice, healthy diet. Isn't that extraordinary? And then you wonder why the public is confused. I wish I could tell you more about this, because there really is. The industry is largely in control of what is being said, even though it may come from the government. The funding support for this last round comes from these institutions. I've sat on these committees myself. I never was aware that we had industry support. And to my colleagues that I've since checked with and asked them that question, do you remember any industry support coming, for this kind of activity? No, I hadn't remembered that. But the last round, until 2002, here's some of the supporters. These are the ones that had the nerve to actually list. Dannon Institute, probably the primary animal protein institute in the world. The number one dairy influence group. International Life Science Institute, that's a group, that really sounds really scientific, doesn't it? That's a collection of the soft drink industry companies. Corporate Donors Fund, these are the people, I guess they didn't want their names to be, so up front, so they kind of dumped it in that kitty in the middle. And then you got Roche Vitamins, B. Johnson, producing drugs, and that's the other way of thinking about health these days. We get healthy by using drugs. We eat the wrong food and we use drugs, to try to solve the problems. MMRs, they're very interested too in health. They didn't list the last one there. That's my choice of words. But it really has to do with the fact that there's a few, unfortunately, in every community. We've got the vast majority of people are very honorable, hardworking, good people, whether it's in medicine, research, policy, whatever. I'm talking about a system. It's a systemic thing that's a whole thing. We're all responsible. And the media play a role. Everybody plays a role. Unfortunately, in the case of the academics, a few academics who have some interest because of their association with industry, they're getting the opportunity to go into Washington, be in the chairs of these committees, and then turn around and select the members who's going to be on them. Very selective process. That's what's happening. Didn't happen before, it's happened recently. And so that's what we tried to do in the book, to tell the story from soup to nuts. It's complex. It's just a start. It's only a start. There's a lot more to learn. But I think we have enough now to know that indeed nutrition, the food we eat, can make one heck of a difference. And it's not just on our personal health. It's the health of our country and the cost of health care, for example, that's now getting rampant. So it's not about vegetarianism. It's not about veganism. It's about health. It's about nutrition. It's about understanding it. And it's about time that we actually get this message out to the rest of the world beyond the vegetarian community. Thank you.
Dr. Campbell, yes, of course, but have you, I'm sure you probably have heard of the Weston Price Foundation. Have you any comments about some of the things they've been saying about your study?
I'm very much aware. In fact, it's really interesting you should ask that question. I was actually, I've been encouraged by some friends to address their concerns or their comments. And so I've actually sat down and written a piece that I was hoping to have available just for this meeting. I couldn't quite get it done. And I'm hoping I can give it to Jeff and he can put it on the website to answer your question. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a group, I can just tell you briefly, it's very vigorous. They're vigorous and objecting to the kind of thing I'm talking about. They get very personal in our criticism, extremely personal. They are not scientists. I mean that emphatically. There's no one on that thing, save for one, was it just a couple of papers, who have actually gone through the process of doing research, submitting their work for peer review in order to get funding, especially, and also to get, I mean, they're not qualified. I have to tell you, they're really, I know I'm being very, very critical, but the rest of you who want to look into this, you can judge me by what I'm saying. They are supported by the farmers of this country. And the one person who's actually put something on the web and has got circulated quite a bit, actually, when I got engaged in a conversation with him, so I learned quite a lot. He's 24 years old, no training in graduate school or anything like that. He's obviously vigorous. He said only people he knows are former vegetarians. And every vegetarian in this country are going to get to know this. He and others recommend diets that may contain, he says cholesterol is a nutrient. They say that, high-fat diet is the way to go. And they base a lot of their arguments on this book by Weston A. Price, who was a dentist back in the 20s and 30s. Went around the world. Rather remarkable man, I must confess, who went around the world, visited a lot of indigenous groups in different parts of the world. He was a dentist, and he wanted to see how the health of the people were living back in the sort of more remote areas, how it was. And he found it, he thought, they were quite healthy. But he was actually monitoring their health according to how many cavities they had, what kind of dental arteries. And so this Weston A. Price Foundation, in my view, have really seriously distorted what Weston Price was all about. Really seriously distorted that, and now making claims about his coming up with recommendations about, eating lots of animal foods. That's simply not true. And the organization, in fact, is an organization that's funded by farmers. I love farmers. I came from the farm. I also know that according to my colleague at Cornell's in economics, agricultural economics, that he says that some of you may know this better than I, but about 90% of the food we now consume comes from factory farms, not from the old family farm. No, it's from factory farms. And the whole factory farm operation is something that we all need to pay attention to. Yeah, they've learned how to produce food en masse, and they do a very good job, I think, in a lot of cases. They've got to feed this whole population. But that's where the money is, the farm community, protecting what they're doing. That's where the money is. But I have my piece done, and maybe if Jeff will agree, put it on your website or something when I get it done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look forward to that. Next question.
Doctor, do you take vitamins, and why or why not?
No, we've never taken vitamins, except just recently I've taken B12. I have to ask my wife how many times. She tells me I have to take B12. No, I mean, there's some evidence that a little B12 for someone who's strictly, eating plant-based materials is probably advisable. I don't know. Dr. Furman can speak to this better than I. He works with patients, and I'm sure that some others do as well. But I don't get too excited about any vitamins. I've never taken any except for a little bit of B12. Because vitamins to me, it's not that they're going to do us harm, especially, multiple vitamin a day, for example, just to kind of get some protection. It's not so much that. It's the fact that people come to rely on that as a means of good health and good nutrition. And they don't change their diet. That's a hoax. That's a hoax at best. But then to take them, in the context of actually, creating a health like that is, we don't, just recently, after about 25 years now, I think there's been some major sort of reviews of all that testing in the last 20, 25 years. It's turning out that they don't work. We can get short-term results sometimes that look pretty good. But we can't project that to the long-term results. Beta-carotene is a perfect example. It was discovered back in the late 70s, early 80s, for example, that foods containing that high in beta-carotene were associated with lower risk for lung cancer, for example. And so a lot of people get interested. It must be the beta-carotene in vegetables. So then they put it in a pill. So then there were some big studies organized in which the people were given different, these are heavy smokers, most susceptible to lung cancer, were given beta-carotene, and they were consuming different amounts of vegetables and grains. The ones consuming the beta-carotene got a higher risk for lung cancer, not lower. And it was highly significant. So it goes to the point that I'm trying to make here is that when we take things out of context, we have to start thinking about the dose. We have to think about everything else. So no, I don't take vitamins.
Sabrina, you got a question there?
Dr. Campbell, thank you for your work, and I was wondering what you thought about fish protein.
I'm sorry, I don't see where that was.
I was wondering what you thought about the protein from fish.
Oh, fish protein. Well, I guess I just, at a cautionary remark again, I don't like to talk too much about, the distinction between one kind of animal protein and another animal protein, because that's the small part of the story. If you're getting the drift of what I'm talking about here, it's whole foods. It's not just the protein itself. But let's go and just consider your question just a little bit. Different kinds of animal proteins have been tested for various and sundry things, including their ability to elevate cholesterol levels, which they do. It's a good nutrient to increase cholesterol levels, animal protein that is. And the fish protein is just, you got all the animal proteins that were tested in this one study of Ken Carroll, for example. All the animal proteins tend to elevate plasma cholesterol, total cholesterol. All the plant proteins compared at the same level of intake are here. Now there's some difference between the animal proteins, one and another, some difference between the plant proteins, one and another, in that particular kind of setting. But the big difference is here's the animal proteins, here's plant proteins, and no overlap. So fish protein can generate some of the adverse effects just like other animal proteins too. But again, jump ahead a stage and ask about the whole fish. Well, there's some evidence that certain kinds of fish, cold water fish maybe, they got a certain kind of oil that they kind of got called omega-3s. They kind of caught on, so eat a little fish, okay. If you're going to stray a bit, that's probably permissible. That's what a lot of people have thought. On the other hand, if we got other problems with fish too. We got dioxin to think about and mercury to think about. And we also can realize that we can get the omega-3 fats too from plant sources. So, in the larger context, I don't know, maybe Dr. Essen has something to say about that later, but, occasional fish, I guess, in the cold water, we can probably stray a little bit now and again without any serious consequences from time to time. We wouldn't know whether we had a consequence or not long term, but in any case, let's say theoretically we can do that. The problem I have with that is this. If you get, let's say you consume a high fat, high salt, animal-based diet, and that's what you become accustomed to, that's your taste preferences. Now, you go over here and start eating this rabbit food. You're not putting, it's low fat, low salt, that kind of thing. I mean, most people, when they jump from here to here, they don't stay there very long. They don't like it, unless they're really committed. And they have a lot of difficulty. But there's one thing that I don't think people are paying attention to. Taste preferences change. They change, and we've got pretty good empirical data on that point now. Salt, person on a high salt diet, you put them on a taste panel, they choose the food with the highest salt. You take them on a low salt diet, make them stay there, keep them under control. They lose a low salt diet for 3 or 4 months. Now you put them back on the taste panel, they want the low salt food. Same thing with fat. Again, Dr. Essen has some comments on that with the Monell Institute you might talk about. But in any case, we do know that taste preferences change. And it's really quite remarkable that my wife and I and our 5 grown children and so forth, at least for us, we changed over time. And, I'm sure a lot of you understand what I'm saying here. I'm sure you've had the same experience. That when you get over to this new sort of more healthy fare, low fat, that's good. Good taste. You look back and go, how in the world did I ever eat that stuff before? Kind of thing. It doesn't set well. And if you want to stray a little bit now and again, without it necessarily causing organic change, the problem is you're teasing yourself. Maintaining that preference or that taste, that's the problem. It's like the 4-pack of cigarette smoker. He wants to quit. He gets down to, let's say, smoking 6 packs, 6 cigarettes a day. That doesn't work. We all know that. Kind of teasing himself to get back there. That's my point.